everyone, and welcome to today's episode. We're going to be talking about These Long Shadows by Jennifer Mismorgan. So, this one is a World War II historical romance and it's set in England. It also fits within the Christian fiction category, and it's the third book in Jennifer Mismorgan's On Victory's Wings series. And all those books are set in England. So, why did I want to read this one? Well, I loved reading the first two books in the series, which is Heart in the Clouds and The Mapmaker's Secret. And I was very keen to read the third book. I pre-ordered the paperback from Jennifer Mismorgan's online store. And because she lives in Canberra, I was able to get the book hand-delivered by the author, which is always fun and special as well. So, all the books I've mentioned and the links will be in the show notes. So, let's talk about the book. These Long Shadows by Jennifer Mismorgan is set in London in England. So it's 1945 where we start chapter one. The prologue is 1943, which I'll get to in a minute. And this one has quite a few romance tropes. So obviously it's a military romance with the World War II setting, and the characters have been in the Air Force. It's also a marriage of convenience combined with a marriage in trouble, which is always a fun trope to read because there's so much conflict and depth that goes with that. We have a second chances romance going on as well, and unrequited love on the part of the hero goes back into the backstory with this one. And there's also a lovely mystery in the story as well. So let's talk about the first line, which is this one. The restaurant swam around her, but at least the nausea had eased enough for her to be out of bed. So this is Katie, our leading lady, who's talking here in the first line. We're in her point of view. So it's 1943 in England. This scene also would fit within Heart in the Clouds, the first book in the series, partway through that story. So if you've read Heart in the Clouds, this will kind of sound familiar. And I'll get back to that in a minute in terms of the setup. So let's talk about Katie. So in 1945, once we start chapter one, she's 21, nearly 22. So she would have been only 19 in the prologue. And she's from Hackney in London, and she's in the military in the Air Force. So what's happening in the prologue is that she ended up getting pregnant. It wasn't intentional in the sense that she was very naive in the situation she got herself in. And the baby daddy is an absolute rat. Awful, awful character. And he lied to her, and one thing led to another. And then she found out she was pregnant and she refused a termination, which was offered to her. And the baby daddy wanted nothing to do with the child and wanted her to get rid of it. It's just awful. And anyway, so this brings in our hero, Jonty, who had been friends with Katie before all of this happened and had feelings for Katie. And he decided to do the honourable thing and take responsibility for the baby and marry her. So the prologue is effectively the setup for the marriage of convenience. So she's had a terrible pregnancy. She was really sick with morning sickness pretty much the whole way through. And Jonty, who I'll give you a bit of information on him. When we start the story in 1945, he's in his mid-20s and was in the military for 6 years and is just discharged from his military service. He's originally from Scotland, so he's a Scotsman and very charming as well, with a heart of gold. And he grew up in a very difficult family situation. He was orphaned very young, and his uncle who raised him was a terrible alcoholic, and it was a very abusive environment. So he was very happy when the war started to enlist and run away and get out of that family of origin situation. So fast forward to the beginning of the book. He was nearly killed during the war, and this is in the backstory in Heart in the Clouds. So if you've read Heart in the Clouds, you'll know what I'm talking about. And he has quite bad scarring on his body, including some very distinctive scars on his face. And so he believes because he's got these scars that no woman could really love him for who he is because of his physical appearance. And he's had this near-death experience, and he was basically the rear gunner in the planes that were flying over bombing Germany. So his life expectancy in the military wasn't great. And back then in 1943, he figured the one thing he could gift Katie with was either if he wasn't there to take care of her, she could be eligible to get a war widow's pension, which would take care of her and the baby. And that was one of his motivations for going into the marriage of convenience, was for her to be cared for. But fast forward to 1945, and he hasn't died in the war. And if we backtrack a bit into the prologue, they get married. She, as I said, she's been very ill pretty much the whole way through the pregnancy. So they haven't had a normal start to a marriage that you would expect. And then the baby is born quite sickly and passes away very, very young, not long after the birth. And it was a really awful, sad, um, or just a heartbreaking situation for both Katie and Jonty to experience. And it also meant that the whole marriage of convenience didn't actually matter. All their reasons went out the window because it was about Katie having the ability to care for the child. So it threw a whole lot of stuff into chaos. And Katie, in her grief, rejected Jonty. So he went back into doing stuff for the war and spent time in France and other places. And we get to chapter 1, and he's now back. They've hardly spoken for 2 years. And Katie really doesn't know where things stand with her and Jonty. Jonty loves her and wants to basically win her back and have a normal marriage with her and to love her. So that's where we start from. So the opening is, it's chapter 1 is at King's Cross Station. So Jonty's written to Katie and said, can you meet me when I come back? And so she's done that. She's also brought her mother with her. Well, her mother insisted on coming, and her younger brothers are there. So it's the meet cute, or the reunion meet cute, is incredibly awkward for everyone involved. And her mother is like trying to listen to what they're saying. It was just very, very difficult for Katie to manage. And what it also means is that she's been living with her mother, father, and younger siblings in the house in Hackney in London. And so Jonty ends up moving in with his in-laws, which of course is also very complicated as well. And London's not in a good place at this time. We've got bombing that has destroyed a whole lot of infrastructure. There's a massive housing shortage because of the bombings that happen in London. There's food rationing going on. I mean, everything's being rationed, and life is just really tough. And that's the environment that we start the story in, where the war in the Pacific is still going, but the war in Europe has ended. So London's not under bomb sirens and everyone having to deal with that, but then trying to start to work out how to actually rebuild the city. And there's a very big divide between the wealthy and the working class as well at this point in time, because the working class are rationed with everything, and the wealthy people can afford to have things that they can't have. And it's quite a stark contrast as well. So this book, there are so many problems. We have both Jonty and Katie who have had to deal with alcoholism in their family of origin. As I mentioned, Jonty's uncle is an alcoholic, and also Katie's father has a very problematic relationship with alcohol, which we see in the story. And she hasn't had the best role model of a marriage from her parents either, which also complicates her own life as she's trying to work out what's going on with Jonty. And so both characters are dealing with grief and loss, and from losing their beloved baby girl. It's a really, really tough time. And the grief process is not a short process for Katie. She's still at the start of the story in the middle of her grief and still working through that, which is understandable considering the high stress circumstances and how traumatic everything is. It's hard enough to lose someone in normal times, but when it's during a war, I think it just heightens everything so much more. And the trauma is so much bigger because being part of a war is also a traumatic experience. So they're dealing with grief and loss. They're both also dealing with PTSD from their family of origin, with what's particularly with the alcoholism in the family that they've had to deal with, and also from things that have happened during the war that have been really tough, and they've will have to work through all the PTSD issues in the story as well. And I won't say any more because I don't want to give away any spoilers. And London is just struggling, and life is hard in London. And so they're trying to navigate that. Katie's got a job as a seamstress working for a very demanding French lady who is desperate for the princesses to come into her dressmaking establishment and get her to do some special dresses for them. So that's quite an interesting part of the story. I enjoyed seeing that as well. So there were so many things I loved about this book. It's an absolute page turner. There's something happening in the story pretty much all the way through. So you turn the page and turn the page and turn the page to see what's happening next. We really get to know Katie in Heart in the Clouds. She came across really probably is not the most likable character, but you could tell that there was a lot going on underneath the surface and things weren't as they seem. And back then, she was a very naive 19-year-old who has had to grow up very fast in the last couple of years with all the tragedy that's happened in her life. And Jonty, as I said, he's just delightful. He has a heart of gold and he's such a loving and caring guy. And he just doesn't want to give up on Katie. He wants to love her and he wants to have a real marriage with her where they can consider the option of having a family down the track and all those kind of things as well. And he's not prepared to give up on her. So their marriage is a disaster. The marriage of convenience, reason doesn't exist. And it would have been quite easy for them to have parted ways. So that's one of the charming things about this romance is looking at why they stuck together because they quite easily could have separated at a number of points in time because the reason they married no longer existed. And it was a really sweet romance that was happening in at a really hard time in the life of England. So there was just there's just trauma everywhere because you've got the trauma from the war still going, the trauma from people managing what's happened in the war. So many people are dealing with grief and loss in so many different ways. And as I said, life is just really hard at that point in time in history as well. And I just love the mystery in the story and how it tied into the side characters who just were fabulous and added so much value to the story. They were realistic in how they were portrayed, and I really appreciated them as well. And it was so fun to see Maggie and Alec from the first book, Heart in the Clouds. And Alex is the Australian airman in that story. We also get to see Grace and Jack from The Mapmaker's Secret, which is the second book in the series. And Jack was the American that was in that story as well. And I loved how there was such a satisfying ending to these long shadows in terms of the way the story all came together at the end. And it was also a lovely ending for the whole series and very satisfying to see what was going on with previous characters from the other books as well. So my favorite book quote is this one. Every stitch she made in a garment, big or small, was an attempt to stitch life back together and mend the gaping tear in her heart. And that's beautiful writing. It's a lovely sentence, just purely looking at the writing. But it also had so much meaning, and there was a metaphor in terms of the sewing aspects in the story as well. And there were a lot of fabric shortages back then. I mean, everything was being rationed. And it was interesting how there were so many different creative ways they made clothing and recycled fabric to do different things as well. And Katie's heart really was torn apart at the beginning of the story, and her grief and the wounds were so raw from having lost her baby daughter. And I loved how in the story we see her journey to healing. So we see her heart and also Jonty's heart healed and their marriage restored. And that also tied into the faith elements in the story. So I would describe this one as having relevant faith elements that were very organic. And a lot of the faith threads in the story related to how the characters managed and processed and worked through the grief and loss that they had experienced as well. So, in terms of the impact on me, there were lots of smiling moments in this book because despite the fact it was dealing with some pretty deep themes like grief and loss, there was a lot of light-hearted and fun moments that I appreciated in the story as well. And there were also times where I almost cried. There's some very poignant moments where the characters are just dealing with some really hard stuff. because grief is really hard. And the way that the grief was presented in the story, the way Jennifer wrote the story, it wasn't sugar-coated. It was very raw and there was lots of emotion. And as a reader, I experienced the grief and emotion on the page and really journeyed with Katie and Jonty in the story as they were navigating the grief and loss and trauma that they were dealing with as well. In terms of trigger warnings, this one, if you're dealing with grief and loss, and that's a hard issue for you at the moment, and if you're sensitive to reading about that, especially a baby passing away, then this one might be one to read later when those issues aren't going to potentially trigger you. But otherwise, I think that Jennifer handled those aspects of the story beautifully, and I really appreciated the authentic and honest way that she wrote about grief and loss. Now, in terms of how to read the books, this is book three in a three-book series, and I would recommend, if you're planning to read all of the books, to read the books in order, because the backstory for These Long Shadows all happens in book one, which is Heart in the Clouds. And we also, because we meet Grace and Jack in this book, it would be better to have read The Mapmaker Secret before you read this one. So, as always, most romances will stand alone as a complete story. So, you can just read this book and not read any of the others. But if you were looking to read the series, definitely read it in order. So, in summary, I would recommend These Long Shadows to readers who like World War II historical romance that's set in England, to readers who like the London setting and really seeing what London was like after the devastation of the bombings in World War II. If you like reading Marriage of Convenience and Marriage in Trouble as a combo in terms of the tropes, then you'll like this one. If you like reading about characters with depth and really getting to the heart of the emotions and seeing that emotion on the page and seeing what's going on in their lives and how they've got to work through a whole lot of hard stuff to process grief. And if you like seeing that in a story, then you'll love this one. If you like reading books with family drama that look at how the impact of the side characters with various problems and issues impact other family members and also affect the main characters, then you'll like this one. And it has relevant faith elements in the story, which I loved as well. Thanks for joining me today. Does These Long Shadows sound like a book that you'd like to read? Or have you already read it? Or have you read the earlier books in the series? What did you think? You can let me know. If you're listening on the podcast, you can send me a text via a link in the show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the episode and leave a comment on the episode. You can also email me via the contact form at my website, which is at narelleatkins.com. And if you've enjoyed listening to this episode, please subscribe at your favorite podcasting app or subscribe at YouTube, and then you'll get a notification so you won't miss an episode. All the books that I've mentioned in this episode, I've got book recommendations on my blog, and there's a link in the show notes. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.